Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're digging into something pretty significant. It's about the US-China trade relationship, how it's shifting, and what that might mean for India's big manufacturing dreams.
Yeah, it's a topic with huge implications, and if you're keeping track of current affairs, maybe for UPSC exams or just general awareness, this one's definitely important.
Absolutely. We're going to try and get under the skin of this, using some recent analysis from the BBC as our guide.
Right. Our mission today, essentially, is to unpack whether this recent trade reset between the U.S. and China is actually good news or potentially bad news for India's manufacturing goals. Well, it's not straightforward.
Okay, let's dive in. So, India's ambition to be a global manufacturing player isn't new, but there was a lot of optimism recently, wasn't there? Especially that news about Apple.
Oh, definitely. The idea that Apple might shift significant iPhone production, the ones heading to the U.S. from China to India, that really created a buzz.
Yeah, it felt like a potential turning point.
And it wasn't just Apple. Um, Shalan Shah over at Capital Economics had this interesting point that something like 40% of what India already sends to the U.S. is pretty similar to what China exports.
So, the thinking was India could potentially just step in as an alternative supplier, maybe quite quickly.
That was the initial thought, yeah. It positioned India as a kind of immediate-term option for U.S. buyers looking elsewhere.
And we saw some hints of that happening on the ground, too, right? I remember reading a survey saying new export orders for Indian manufacturers hit a 14-year high.
Exactly. That suggested Indian firms were starting to pick up some of that slack, filling gaps left by Chinese producers.
Nomura also chimed in, didn't they? Mentioning some anecdotal evidence.
They did. They talked about seeing signs, maybe not hard data everywhere yet, but stories suggesting India was benefiting from trade diversion, supply chains shifting, especially in areas like, basic electronics assembly, textiles, even toys.
So the picture initially looked pretty positive for India. Things seemed to be moving in the right direction.
Right. But then, this trade reset happened. The U.S. and China met, I think it was in Switzerland.
Yeah, and the outcome was significant. A big drop in those Trump-era tariffs on Chinese goods. What were the numbers again?
Well, the report suggests they dropped from a really high level, maybe 145%, down to around 30%.
Okay, 30%. And how does that compare to India's rate for similar goods going into the U.S.?
That's the key point. India's rate is already around 27%. So suddenly, that gap, that advantage India might have had from tariffs, it shrinks considerably.
I see. And that's raised some alarms, hasn't it? I saw Ajay Srivastava from the Global Trade Research Institute, GTRI, expressing concern.
Yeah, his worry is pretty clear. He thinks this easing of tensions could make companies that were thinking of moving manufacturing investment from China to India, well, it might make them pause or even head back.
So the fear is that while India might keep attracting the really basic assembly stuff because it's still low cost.
Exactly. That might survive. But the more valuable stuff, the growth in actual value-added manufacturing, component making, design, that's what's potentially at risk. If the main reason to leave China, those high tariffs, gets weaker.
Which really puts a different spin on that earlier optimism around Apple, doesn't it? And didn't Trump himself say something to Tim Cook about not building in India because of tariffs?
Yeah, there were reports of that conversation kind of discouraging Apple from setting up shop in India due to, ironically, high Indian tariffs at the time. It just adds another layer of complexity.
Okay, so that's the immediate worry sparked by this US-China reset. But some argue, don't they, that the bigger picture, the long-term strategic shift away from China by the US, will still benefit India regardless.
That's the counterargument, yes. The idea is that, this tariff adjustment might be more tactical, damage control perhaps, but the underlying strategic competition and the U.S. desire to diversify supply chains, that trend isn't necessarily going away.
And India's own government seems more open now to foreign companies compared to maybe some past protectionist phases.
That's also part of the long-term optimistic view. There does seem to be a greater willingness from the Modi government to engage, to open doors, which could create a more welcoming environment for investment over time.
Plus, India is actively negotiating trade deals. We've got the talks with the U.S. ongoing, and that deal with the U.K. was signed recently.
Right. And that UK deal, with concessions on things like whiskey tariffs and cars, it's seen by some as a signal, maybe, of what India might be willing to put on the table in negotiations with the U.S. Lowering duties could definitely make India more attractive.
Okay, but let's temper that optimism a bit. The BBC report was quite clear that it's not a done deal for India. Competition is stiff.
Very true. The Nomura economist really stressed this point. Companies looking to move production aren't just looking at India. Vietnam is a huge competitor. Other Southeast Asian countries, too. India is not the only game in town.
And that brings us back to an old story. For India, it's not just about global wins, it's about the domestic climate, the ease of doing business. That still matters hugely, right?
Absolutely critical. Any advantage from tariffs or global shifts can be wiped out if it's still too difficult or costly to actually operate in India. Manufacturing has been stuck around 15% of India's GDP for, what, 2 decades?
Yeah.
That tells you something about the persistent hurdles.
We've had government schemes like the PLI, the production-linked incentive, trying to boost things. How successful have they been?
Well, according to Niti Aayog, the government's own think tank, the success in really moving the needle on manufacturing's share of GDP has been, let's say, limited so far.
And Niti Aayog itself identified reasons why India hasn't captured more of the investment leaving China, didn't they?
Yes, their own assessment pointed to factors where other countries often score better, cheaper labor sometimes, simpler tax systems, generally lower tariffs, and crucially, being part of more free trade agreements already. India's faced challenges on those fronts.
Another big one seems to be the reliance on China for parts, especially in electronics. Like, even if you assemble an iPhone in India,
You're still importing a lot of the high-value components, often from China itself. That limits the actual economic benefit India gets from just assembly.
Ajay Srivastava made that point quite starkly, didn't he, about the actual value India keeps.
He did. He estimated that for maybe a $1,000 iPhone exported from India, India might only capture less than $25 of that value. The real win comes if you start making more of the phone inside India.
So just being an assembly hub might not deliver the quality jobs or the economic boost hoped for. It could even attract unwanted scrutiny from the U.S. without much gain.
That's the worry. GTRI also noted the jobs created are often not particularly high skill or high paying. It's different from, say, the old Nokia model in Chennai where suppliers moved in too, creating a whole ecosystem. Now it seems more focused on importing parts and pushing for lower duties on those imports.
And there's even the slightly uncomfortable possibility that some Chinese firms might just use India as a way to reroute goods to the U.S. to avoid tariffs.
That's a concern that's been raised. And it's interesting, India's own principal economic advisor has talked about potentially attracting Chinese firms to set up export manufacturing in India.
Which could be seen as what? An admission that India's own industrial policy needs more firepower.
You could interpret it that way, a sort of tacit acknowledgement perhaps of the limits so far. But experts also warn that leaning too heavily on bringing in foreign firms, even Chinese ones, might hinder the development of India's own local capabilities, its own industrial know-how. It's a really tricky balance.
So it sounds like, despite some positive headlines, the road ahead for India's factory nation ambitions is still pretty long and challenging.
That seems to be the overall message from the analysis, yes. Lots of potential, but also significant hurdles remain, both internal and external.
And Ajay Srivastava's advice to policymakers was quite direct. Focus on the fundamentals, cut production costs, sort out logistics, create predictable regulations.
Yeah, and his final thought was quite sobering. This U.S.-China reset, it's damage control, not a long-term fix. India needs to think strategically, play the long game, otherwise it risks being left behind.
So for you, the listener, particularly if you're preparing for UPSC, the main thing to grasp is this real tension. There's opportunity in the shifting global trade patterns, definitely.
But capitalizing on it fully depends heavily on India tackling its own long-standing challenges. The business environment, infrastructure, skills, component dependency, and navigating this complex, evolving relationship between the U.S. and China.
It really makes you think, doesn't it? What specific policy levers do you think India needs to pull right now to really make the most of this moment?
We'd genuinely love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, definitely. So if you found this deep dive useful, please do give us a like, subscribe for more discussions like this, and drop your comments or questions below. And remember, our conversation today drew heavily on analysis reported by the BBC. Over to you. What does India need to do next?